So it's a win-win situation for Erdogan and Netanyahu. They both win. By weakening Syria, which was the only country that was resisting Israel, it has to be broken. And of course, if Syria is broken, then Lebanon is surrounded. And therefore, it makes things a lot more easy for the Israeli regime to end the resistance. So when people speak about Islamic extremism, I would say this has nothing to do with Islam. This is American extremism. This is NATO extremism. This is Western extremism. So what we have now is HTS. But that was before Nusra, and before that was Al-Qaeda. Sorry for repeating, but I want your viewers to, who may not be acquainted, all of them, to get more acquainted with these names. The names change, but the organization is the same. The assault, I just want to point out that the Turkish government, which continues to send oil, Baku oil, cheap oil to Israel after 14 months, which never sent a bullet to Gaza, which never gave Lebanon any support, they decided to invade Syria, which was supporting Lebanon, which was hosting 500,000 refugees and helping the resistance.
Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to our shows, do hit that subscribe button. You can also donate in the link given in the description box, be a YouTube member by hitting the join button, or be a Patreon by following the Patreon link. That's a lot in the Global South. But the easiest thing you can do is to watch our shows, hit like, share, and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest, Professor Mohammad Marandi. Professor Marandi is a professor at the University of Tehran, Iran. Professor Marandi, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Last time you were on, we discussed Palestine at great length. We'll have that as the backdrop of our discussion today. But if we could start with new developments in Syria, where Islamist rebels in Syria launched a large-scale attack on government forces, causing the largest shift in the balance of power since 2020 in the country, where more than a decade of war has taken place. Battling Iran and Russian-backed Assad government, the rebels in a lightning offensive captured Aleppo, which was Syria's largest city before the war, and then advanced south to take the strategic and symbolic city of Hama before closing in on Homs. What's your assessment of what has happened in Syria since November 27?
Well, I do really have to touch upon Palestine to answer this question. It is important to note that what happened in Syria began a couple of decades ago, but it began in earnest in 2011. And the United States had made a decision to overthrow the Syrian government. The United States used weapons from Libya when they overthrew the Libyan government and sent them to Istanbul to give them to their allies in Syria. The most important group in Syria at that time was Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda, what you call the Islamists, although I would disagree with the term because I don't think they represent the Islam that we know. But Al-Qaeda was receiving these arms. And this was something that Iranian intelligence was stating very early on, but Western media and Western politicians were ridiculing the Iranians. But later on, it came out, thanks to WikiLeaks, that Jake Sullivan, who is now the U.S. National Security Advisor, he said in an email on February the 12th, 2012, that in Syria, Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda is on our side. So the United States was using the terrorist organization that carried out 9/11, according to the United States, 10 years later, to overthrow the Syrian government and also to overthrow the government in Libya, where they were more successful. Later on, Al-Qaeda, for reasons that I think we don't need to discuss here, split into two groups. Now, Al-Qaeda was being supported by NATO countries, foreign fighters who were coming in from across the world, including Europe and North America, but also across the Arab world and elsewhere, Central Asia. And the United States, the Europeans were also using an extraordinarily large amount of funding from oil and gas-rich countries in the Persian Gulf. But the command centers were in Amman in Jordan, but most importantly in Turkey. Now, in late 2011, I was told by a very knowledgeable person with a very important background, Alistair Crook, who at that time had a think tank and who had left government, the British government. He was also an advisor to the head of the foreign policy head of the EU. He established a think tank, and he told me, because in the 1980s he was in Afghanistan, he was in Pakistan, and they were dealing with the situation in Afghanistan. And he told me that the West is behind the dirty war in Syria. And he told me the reason I know is because all the people who I knew in Pakistan are now in Istanbul. So the people who are involved in Afghanistan through Pakistan are now involved in Syria through Turkey. But there's also much more evidence. We have the US Defense Intelligence Agency document of 2012 that was released. In it, this intelligence organization, the largest military intelligence organization in the world, in it, it says that US allies in the region wanted to create a Salafist entity between Syria and Iraq. Why? Because they wanted to break the path between Syria and Iraq and isolate Syria even more. What was that Salafist entity? It was ISIS. ISIS was a part of Al-Qaeda until it broke away because of differences over how to organize. ISIS wanted the Islamic State of Iraq, created the Nusra part of the group, and then when it declared itself the Islamic State of Iraq, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, then Nusra didn't accept and they broke away. So they had the same ideology. And the current head of Hayat Tahrir Sham was therefore in Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and then when he was the head of the Nusra Front, which changed its name to Hayat Tahrir Sham, in the presence of Al-Qaeda, they broke away from Al-Qaeda. In other words, the Al-Qaeda senior officials were brought in and said, look, we're no longer with these people. In other words, and Al-Qaeda was sitting there saying, yes, he isn't with us. They aren't with us. In other words, they are together. But for practical purposes, they decided to say, okay, we're not a part of Al-Qaeda. For public diplomacy purposes, for CNN purposes, and so on. So the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, later in an interview on Al Jazeera, of all places, said that the US government supported this policy. Obama supported this. Supported what? What regional countries wanted to do, to create a Salafist entity between Syria and Iraq. So when people speak about Islamic extremism, I would say this has nothing to do with Islam. This is American extremism. This is NATO extremism. This is Western extremism. It has nothing to do with, it's not indigenous to our culture. I think this is something that Indians should also recognize. But there's also even more interesting evidence. In a leaked audio, and all of this is online, in a leaked audio, the US Secretary of State, Kerry, said to so-called Syrian opposition troops that we allowed ISIS to advance on Damascus. So the evidence is overwhelming, and I can give you all sorts of other bits and pieces of information. But the fact is that ISIS and Al-Qaeda and their affiliates, they were a part of a dirty war by the West to undermine Syria. Back then, the Western media, and unfortunately Arabic media, was demonizing the Syrian government. And also these Al-Qaeda groups carried out false flag operations, chemical weapons operations, and the West tried to blame Syria because they were with these terrorist groups. But there's very good investigative journalism carried out by a number of people, actually. But Aaron Matei did a very good piece describing how this was a false flag operation, and how the OPCW, which is a UN affiliated organization that deals with chemical weapons, their experts went to Syria, and the analysts who were in Syria said that the evidence doesn't show it was the Syrian government. But when they went back to their organization, the politicians moved them from the team, from the report writing, and they wrote the report blaming Syria. There's a lot of evidence for this, and if anyone is interested, they can go and read Aaron Matei's piece or his works on this matter. But in any case, so these groups were supported by the West, but the Western media was supporting them, and Arabic media was supporting them, because the Arabic media is owned by these oil-rich regimes for the most part. And the White Helmets, which was created by British intelligence, was working side by side with Al-Qaeda or the Nusra Front or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, because Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is Nusra. So what we have now is HTS, but that was before Nusra, and before that was Al-Qaeda. Sorry for repeating, but I want your viewers to, who may not be acquainted, all of them, to get more acquainted with these names. The names change, but the organization is the same. They keep changing the label, but it's the same thing. So the so-called white helmets that the West was always speaking about, and in Hollywood they were trying to promote them, their office was right beside the central office in Aleppo, when they occupied Aleppo, in eastern Aleppo, as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or the Al-Qaeda group. I'll just say Al-Qaeda from now on. So they were not independent. They were not, civil society people. They were working with Al-Qaeda. So the West created a huge public diplomacy apparatus to support these Al-Qaeda and ISIS terrorists and their affiliates, to undermine Syria. Why? Because of Israel. All US policy in our region is centered around Israel. That's why they can carry out a Holocaust in Gaza and get away with it. That's why they can carry out genocidal attacks on Lebanon. Nothing happens. No one is punished. No one is sanctioned. No country is sanctioned, because everything is being done for the sake of Israel, basically. All US policy in our region. Netanyahu was the chief promoter of the war on Iraq. And the United States invaded Iraq. And the United States, as a result, spent trillions of dollars, wasted trillions of dollars, and killed over 1 million people. But since Israel wanted it, they did it. So the point is that these extremists are Western-backed. These extremists are very cruel and dangerous people. They have a horrific background. They slaughter innocent people. They consider everyone who does not think like them to be worthy of death, and they would carry out very ugly executions, and they have done some already on on this occasion, even though they're trying to promote themselves in a different way, but they're the same people. So, what happened recently? There's a war going on in Gaza. Not a war, but a genocide, supported by the West. Day and night, women and children are slaughtered. Who is trying to stop the genocide? The Axis of Resistance. Two members are Ansarullah in Yemen, who blocked the Red Sea so that to put pressure on the Israeli regime to stop it, and the Iraqis, who fire missiles and drones at the Israeli regime to put pressure on them to stop the genocide. But the third was Hezbollah. Hezbollah began on October the 8th when they knew that the Israeli regime was about to carry out a genocide. They began to attack Israel because the Israelis were saying we're going to cut off the water for everyone, the food, the electricity, the fuel. That's what the Minister of Defense said. We're going to cut off everything. We're going to starve them. And then the Prime Minister called the Palestinians Amalek, which in biblical terms was a tribe which was completely wiped out, including their children and animals. And the president said that there are no innocents in Gaza. So it was obvious that the intention was genocide from day one. And all the lies about children's being beheaded and the rapes, all was that these lies were carried out in order to enable this genocide. So Hezbollah saw this coming, and they began attacking Israeli troops on the border to draw away part of the army from Gaza, to prevent them from wiping out the population. And they did this for a year, until the Israeli regime attacked Lebanon and sought revenge. So Hezbollah was in a very painful war where every time they'd win on the battlefield, the Israelis would bomb cities. We saw that. They destroyed southern Beirut. They destroyed Baalbek. They destroyed towns and villages. They would target families. They would especially communities that were supporting the resistance. Hezbollah would hold them on the border. The Israelis failed to make any inroads into Lebanon, which I think was extraordinary. And the biggest heroes in this whole year and 2 months is Hezbollah, because they willingly made sacrifices to save the children of Gaza. So when there was finally a ceasefire, and the Americans put pressure, and Netanyahu needed a ceasefire because the Israeli army was exhausted and they had many casualties, the next day, this attack began. And also, Netanyahu said that we need to deal with the so-called Iran threat. And the Israelis constantly threatened Syria. Before this assault by al-Qaeda, which was organized by Turkey, by Erdogan, the Israelis bombed all of the connecting routes between Lebanon and Syria, so that Hezbollah couldn't go to the aid of the Syrian people against these groups. And then the assault began. So, and I don't want to explain the assault, I just want to point out that the Turkish government, which continues to send oil, Baku oil, cheap oil to Israel after 14 months, which never sent a bullet to Gaza, which never gave Lebanon any support, they decided to invade Syria, which was supporting Lebanon, which was hosting 500,000 refugees and helping the resistance. So Turkey, which was cooperating with the Israeli regime, doing trade, sending oil, even after Netanyahu was declared, because the Turkish government always made this, this ridiculous claim that for legal reasons they can't stop the flow of oil, which was nonsense. But after Netanyahu, the ICC declared Netanyahu to be a criminal and gave out an arrest warrant for him and his former Minister of Defense, they could have stopped trading because they said, for that reason, because of the ICC. But they continue to sell. Even now, they they're selling oil. So the Israeli regime carries out the genocide with oil coming through Turkey. And they do trade and they have diplomatic relations. So, and when the Israeli regime was thinking about attacking Lebanon, the president of Turkey, Erdogan, said, we will send troops to Lebanon to support Lebanon. So he never sent troops, he never sent anything. He did trade with the Israelis, and then he invaded Syria. So what does that say about Mr. Erdogan?
I think the role of Turkey here is pretty interesting. Of course, like Erdogan has a long history in the Syrian dirty war, where he had openly backed um, the fundamentalist forces in the hope that they would weaken the Kurdish resistance or the Kurdish forces, who have a goal of an independent statelet, let's say, which also covers part of both North Syria but also Turkey. Um, One of the hopes that is said is that Erdogan hopes that by backing the so-called rebel forces now, he expects some of the refugees. There are different numbers that are quoted, like 1 million in the Turkey occupied two strips in northern Syria and 3 million somewhere within Turkey, Syrian refugees. He hopes that some of them might go back to the um, to the hopefully the Sunni Islamist fundamentalist regain forces. But it can also backfire if Russian warplanes and Syrian warplanes actually reverse this, as they had done since 2015 at least, and there can be more types of waves into Turkey. What's the strategic calculation here in terms of the refugees?
I don't think that is really the reason behind this. In fact, if Turkey took a decent position and ended this dirty war and withdrew from northern Syria and withdrew its terrorists, because these terrorists come from across Asia and across the world, and especially a large number of them come from Central Asia and China. And these people are now trained and now they're drunk in victory. If they go to India, if they go to Central Asia, if they go to Afghanistan, if they go to China, if they go to they could cause a lot of trouble. They're now well trained there. So Erdogan has created a multinational terrorist organization, or terrorist organizations, because they're multiple groups, and they're constantly infighting. And if they do take Syria, they'll start killing each other, because when they were in Idlib, they were killing each other. But Erdogan, for this assault, was able to organize them under one command. But it's not going to stay that way. But in any case, if he wanted refugees to go back, what he would have had to do was to normalize with Syria. But when there's constant war going on, when they're terrorists there, how can people go back? What Erdogan really wants is influence in Syria. He considers it to be a part of Turkish culture and Turkish civilization, and that it was a part of the Ottoman Empire. So it is their legitimate realm of influence. And since he is from the Muslim Brotherhood himself, although the Muslim Brotherhood is a very divided organization, it's not a single organization, but in any case, he has a special relationship with those people affiliated to the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria. It's interesting, though, that Erdogan had very good relations before with the Syrian president. In fact, he and his wife would go on vacation with the president of Syria and his wife. their relations were closer than Iranian-Syrian relations, for example. They were neighbors, they were doing business, but then he turned against them. But I think that the issue really is enhancing his influence, but also at the price of the Palestinians and the resistance. He did it in coordination with the Israelis and the Americans so that they would support him in gaining that influence in Syria. So it's a win-win situation for Erdogan and Netanyahu. They both win. By weakening Syria, both win, and that's what both of them support. And the Americans, they continue to bomb Syria. The Israelis have bombed Syria. And the Israelis don't bomb the opposition. But they bombed the Syrian government hundreds of times over the years. So it's clear who is siding with whom. But we have to see what happens. Right now, it's a very critical moment. The coming days will be very critical. We saw the Iran Ayatollah Khamenei. He sent his a representative to meet President Assad today. We saw the statements today made by the Iranian foreign minister, who said that we support a Syrian opposition, but a legitimate one, nonviolent one, not a terrorist organization. And the foreign minister of Russia also said that HTS is a terrorist organization. What Turkey is trying to do is have Al-Qaeda rule over Syria. And the West is trying to legitimize this. They're trying to present them as moderate. The same people who carried out 9/11, the same organization. This is, or at least what the West says. The West is so hypocritical that I think this raises questions about 9/11. Something that I never questioned, actually. I was one of those who believed that 9/11 was probably carried out by Al-Qaeda. Maybe some elements within the U.S. intelligence allowed it to happen for their own, but I don't know. Who knows? When the United States is so sinister that it creates ISIS and Al-Qaeda and it destroys, and when it allows the Israelis to carry out Holocaust in Gaza, then anything is believable with the United States after what we've seen over the past decade and a half. But the issue, I don't think, has much to do with the refugees. The issue has to do with Erdogan's wish to have greater influence. It is his ego to a large degree. And it's not in the interest of Turkey, by the way. Turkey will have a very difficult time with Syria, with Al-Qaeda at the realm. It will create great difficulty, and not just in Syria, but across the region. It will have implications that I think will be very difficult for countries across the region, but Turkey first and foremost. First of all, Al-Qaeda is not going to improve the lives of the Syrians. Maybe Qatar will give them some money to do some things because they are also supporting them, but Qatar is the banker, but paying for a few thousand or a couple of, let's say 20,000, 30,000, whatever, terrorists is one thing, but running a state is another, especially when it's under such severe sanctions by the United States. And the United States is not going to remove sanctions, even for Al-Qaeda. Why? Because the United States doesn't want a strong Syria. Because Israel doesn't want a strong Syria. It doesn't matter who's in charge. They want a broken and fragmented Syria. They want a broken Lebanon. They want a weak and broken Jordan. That's why Jordan is so weak. That is why Egypt is so weak. That is intentional. So Syria, which was the only country that was resisting Israel, it has to be broken. And of course, if Syria is broken, then Lebanon is surrounded. And therefore, it makes things a lot more easy for the Israeli regime to end the resistance. So in a sense, the fall of the Syrian government would be great news for both Israel and for Erdogan, but it would be terrible news for the region. Even though there are quite a few people who are now supporting this these terrorists because they're influenced by Arabic media in the region, which is trying to, you know, to give them um, a positive image, or you know, give a positive image to the public about present the public with a positive image of these terrorists.
How do you see the US-Turkey relationship as far as this dirty war is concerned? Because there are, at some levels, there are convergences in terms of CIA operatives supporting radical fundamentalist groups to weaken Assad government, because both Turkey and the US want, backed by Israel, obviously want Assad to go. It was part of the original Netanyahu plan, who laid out 7 countries in the Middle East and across Africa, which should be toppled. And later General Wesley Clark, I think, he confirmed it, that it was Syria, Lebanon, Iran, Iraq, Sudan, Yemen, that these were the countries that should go. But there are
Yeah.
also Libya, yeah. But there are also differences, particularly thinking in the context of Turkey, is the Kurdish separatist forces. The northeastern part that is held by many of these Kurdish nationalist forces are backed by the US, are opposed by Turkey. So there is a serious difference there. Of course, Turkey wants to use Al Qaeda to balance them, some kind of balance of forces game there. How do you see Turkey US relationship or equation there?
It's complicated, but the real issue is that Erdogan is unable to make the right decision, which would solve the problem in those areas controlled by the Americans illegally. An illegal American presence. They illegally occupy 1/3 of Syria. They're stealing the oil and the grain for years. They're starving the Syrian people and they're stealing their oil and grain. It is extraordinary what's happening in northeastern Syria. It's extraordinary. The Americans are they are petty thieves. Their soldiers are thieves. They protect oil wells so that the oil can be taken out of Syria and sold. And the Syrian people are under extreme sanctions, the Caesar sanctions, starvation sanctions, and their oil is being openly stolen by an illegal US presence. But in any case, if Erdogan wanted to deal with this issue, just like the issue of refugees, the solution was normalization with Syria. If the Syrian government was allowed to strengthen, to take its territory, to not constantly fight his Al Qaeda and terrorists and the ISIS terrorists and others, their affiliates, then they would be able to spend more time in asserting their control over the country. There would be more trade, thus more people would return to Syria. There would be more security, thus the US-backed terrorists or Kurdish groups in northeastern Syria, they would be forced to disarm. It's very clear what the solution is. But Erdogan wants the Erdogan solution, not the just solution, not the more. Erdogan is the person who's murdered hundreds of thousands of Syrians. He is responsible. The West likes to say that Assad killed hundreds of thousands of his own people. No, it was Erdogan who's more responsible for the deaths in Syria than any individual, even the Americans and the Israelis, because it was done through his territory. It was done through his border. He cooperated. There was a Lebanese journalist, Serena Sheem, who was investigating how near Ain al Arab or Kobani, the Turkish government was sending ISIS troops and ISIS weapons, ISIS troops and ISIS weapons through World Food Organization trucks into Syria. She reported on that. Then Turkish intelligence said that she's a terrorist or she's a spy. I don't remember right now. People can look it up. Her story is out there. She then went on air, live on television, and said, I'm worried about myself. I'm not a spy. I'm not, I'm just reporting. She was telling the truth about what the sinister role that Turkish intelligence was playing in Syria. She died that day in a car accident. They tried to cover it up. They never carried out an investigation. They murdered her. They said that it was a truck driver, and no one believes it. She was an American, by the way, an American Lebanese with 2 kids. The American embassy did nothing. No investigation, no call for investigation. Why? Because she was reporting what was back then being hidden from the world. That Turkey was supporting ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So if Syria was able, so he's responsible for these deaths more than anyone else. But if he made the right decision and withdrew, then the Kurdish issue would be solved, at least relatively speaking. The issue of refugees would be improved, but he didn't choose that. He decided to go ahead with invading Syria once again, repeating what he did in 2011, 12, and 13.
I wanted to ask you, Professor Marandi, very briefly, if the Shia Sunni framework is even applicable in this dirty war. We discussed earlier how in Palestine that's absolutely inapplicable because Hezbollah was one of the greatest defenders of the Palestinian people and Hamas. But in Syria, it is said there's a lot talked about the Alawite community, the constituency from which President Assad draws his support. And there is a long history that is told. I don't want to repeat. But Iran, the Iran-backed militia forces in Iraq, Hezbollah, and Assad's constituency are all Shias. And some people report that Turkey sees the radical Sunni fundamentalists as also a factor of balancing the Shia resistance force. Do you think there is any merit in this line of analysis?
No. First of all, Assad is not Shia. He is Alawi, and they're different from Shia. Second of all, his own wife is Sunni. Third of all, in Syria, Sunni people are influential in government, in the private sector. Aleppo is a Sunni city. Assad has support from different communities. I've been to Syria throughout the Dirty War. I was there multiple times in 2013, 14, 15, 16. I've lectured at the University of Damascus many times. I've met many students. At least half of the students are Sunni Arab. Some of them liked Assad, some of them didn't like him, some of them hated him, some of them loved him. But none of the people I spoke to wanted the terrorists. That's a different thing altogether. So even his opponents said, we're scared of these people. And it's not just Alawites, by the way. There are Christians, there are Druze. The Shia is actually the smallest group. They're like 1 or 2%. They're in not a significant number. And then there are the Kurds, who are Sunni predominantly. It's a mixed country with a with a great deal of diversity. But these terrorists don't accept diversity. They're ISIS. You believe that they killed more Sunnis in Iraq and Syria than any other community. They've slaughtered Sunnis. The reason why Hezbollah came in The reason why the Iraqi Popular Mobilization Forces came in to support the Syrian government was because Turkey and Jordan, with the help of all the NATO and others, brought in tens of thousands of foreign fighters. Hezbollah entered the battle in Syria in mid-2013. By that time, there were already tens of thousands of foreign fighters brought into Syria. And then Iran began to get involved, and then in 2015, the Russians began to get involved. So this has nothing to do with Shia and Sunni. Otherwise, the key issue in the region is the Palestinian people who are Sunni. All the sacrifices that the resistance is making is for the sake of the Palestinian people. Otherwise, Hezbollah, they can just live their lives in Lebanon and ignore the Palestinians. Ansarullah could have cut a deal with the Americans in Yemen. Hezbollah could have cut even a better deal with the Americans. So, no, it doesn't make any sense. The bulk of the martyrs of Syria who fought against these extremist groups were Sunni. These groups are NATO-backed. They are the people that NATO created. And Wahhabism is not traditionally central to Sunni Islam. It was an ideology that was predominant in an area in the Arabian Peninsula called Najd. But because of oil wealth and because of the Saudi-US alliance, it was promoted by the Saudis. And that's what they were promoting in Afghanistan. In fact, you may know this, but the University of Nebraska Omaha, they were the first ones to publish takfiri literature for school children in Afghanistan. First of all, the Americans supported extremist groups in Afghanistan to induce a Soviet invasion. Many people don't know that. Carter, the human rights president, Carter and Brzezinski but it was Brzezinski's idea, but he put it to Carter and he approved it. They gave funding to these extremists in Afghanistan in order to encourage the Soviet Union to invade the country. So they sacrificed Afghanistan in order to create a Vietnam for the Soviet Union. How sinister can that be? And then what did they do? The first books that were published, school books for children, takfiri books, were published in the United States by an American university. And then, of course, the Saudis came in and began to spend more money, and the madrasas became, and this extremism became a problem not just in Afghanistan, but in Pakistan, a very moderate Sunni country, conservative, moderate Sunni. But, when you have all this oil wealth coming in, when you have these mosques, brand new mosque with all this oil money, whether in Pakistan or anywhere else in the world, how can other Muslim organizations compete with the oil money coming from the Persian Gulf? So in any case, the point is that this is not Sunni Islam. These groups, ISIS, do not represent Sunni Islam. Al-Qaeda do not represent Sunni Islam. And that is why they're sponsored by the West.
I remember this famous photograph of Mujahideen leaders from Afghanistan going to the White House. I'm not sure if it was during the Carter or the Reagan administration, but there was this famous photograph.
It was Reagan.
Yeah, Reagan administration, yes. This was back in the days where communism had to be toppled, and so the Mujahideens were trained. They never knew they were to later turn against the Americans. I think.
But I should point out that I'm not saying that all the people who resisted in Afghanistan were extremists.
Mm-hmm.
When the Soviet Union invaded, they were legitimately defending their country. But there are those who are getting money from the CIA. There are those who are getting money from the Western intelligence agencies. That's a different thing. Opposing an invasion of one's country is one thing. Being a tool, especially before the invasion of a Western power, is a different thing. What happened in Syria, the issue for Iran is not about, as the foreign minister said, is not about opposition to the Syrian government. It is an illegitimate organization, terror organization, that is being promoted by Erdogan and his allies. And the West will not do anything in Syria or in our region that goes against Israeli regime interests. I have no doubt about that. Never. If it's India and Israel, it's Israel. If it's the UK and Israel, it's Israel. If it's Saudi Arabia and Israel, it's Israel. Israel is what's important to them.
You,
So,
sorry,
yes.
go ahead.
No. Okay.
You mentioned about creating the Vietnam moment in Afghanistan. Now there are talks about creating a Saigon moment for the Russians. There is this recent article in the Wall Street Journal where they cited some of their think tanks, leading think tank scholars, who thinks that this is a Saigon moment for the Russians and the Russian allied Iran, because Assad government is falling, and Homs, they say, is the last litmus test, and the resistance force cannot regroup themselves. So if you read any of the Western press, the Financial Times, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, these are the papers I follow more closely, but also Guardian and others. The picture is that it's gone, it's over. Some kind of picture that we knew prior to 2015, when Russian airplanes came in and started reversing the fortunes. What do you think is the balance of power at the moment between the so-called rebel forces on one hand and the Assad government backed by Iran and Russia on the other hand?
Well, it's quite clear, as you pointed out, where the West stands. They stand with Al-Qaeda. Israel stands with Al-Qaeda, and Erdogan stands with Al-Qaeda. And I think that says more than enough. And those who are supporting Erdogan in our region are either very naive, and there are many naive people who believe this propaganda and who don't know the backstory and they don't have the information, or they are sinister people. And there are quite a few of them. But ordinary people are can be fooled. It's difficult to say where this will go at this stage because Western media and regional media is on the side of Al-Qaeda, but also it's very clear that social media is being manipulated by the United States to spread the voices of Al-Qaeda and their supporters. The psychological warfare that's being carried out, and also how the voices and are being exaggerated. I think is quite clear. We've seen how social media has been used as a tool against Iran in the past. When there was unrest in Iran, you would have global. Iran would be at the top of the news. It would be trending across the world. Obviously, it was that was intensified by Twitter, by Facebook, by Instagram. And then when you have the Holocaust in Gaza, it often not even there wouldn't be trends, even though people are speaking about it every day. So it wouldn't be trending. So it's obvious that Western media, social media, and regional media owned by these oil and gas-rich regimes that are close to the United States are with this. And of course, in Turkey, because Erdogan is his partner in government is a right-wing fanatical party, and they believe in reviving the Ottoman Empire. That he's a sort of contradictory person. On the one hand, he's speaking of Islam, and on the other hand, he's speaking about Turkish nationalism, which the two are not. The two do not work together. They're like they're like oil and water.
The
Because
HTS also is now talking about Syrian nationalism.
yes, exactly. So they're
Jelani.
using terrorist groups from China and from and Uzbekistan and Tajikistan and elsewhere, and speaking about Syrian nationalism. So you have these extraordinary contradictions at play. But I think it's still too early to say what will happen. I think that today the foreign ministers of Iran and Russia took a very tough position on Al Qaeda, and I think that may be reflected on the battlefield. So we'll have to see. Right now, things do not look good for the Syrian government, but I think that we should not be influenced by all the rumors. And it's, there's a huge, as I said, there's a huge psychological warfare campaign going on. And there's a lot of money and influence behind it. So they've won all the battles, ISIS and Al Qaeda, on the internet, but we'll have to see if they win on the battlefield. It's I have reason to believe that it's going to be difficult for them, and they may not win, and they may in the long run actually uh, be on the losing side. I can't say for certain, but I think that the defenses are probably going to be toughening in the coming hours and days. And if they succeed in holding them back, meaning the Syrians and their allies, then I think gradually the tide will turn.
I wanted to ask you a specific question about Iranian ground support because at the strategic level, the talks are it's Russian planes and Iranian ground support, and by ground support, Quds forces are also talked about, and also the militia forces in Iraq. Do you have any information whether Iran has made any commitment about ground support? In Syria, because that is being considered by many military experts as very, very critical if Assad has to regain some of these territories.
Yes, I think that the Iranians they've already sent in advisors. I think the Iraqis have also sent in troops, and the advisors are not small in number. I think that again, there hasn't been enough much time. The Russians and the Iranians were uh, this was very surprising. It was coming while the resistance was fighting against Israel. All the focus was on Israel. Now no one's even thinking about Israel. Erdogan turned attention away from Israel, and now he's basically helping Israel surround surround Hezbollah to, it's amazing. So I think everyone was pretty shocked that Erdogan would do such a thing, such an immoral act, and such a sensitive moment, but he did. Uh, so Russia and Iran were caught off guard, but I think they are moving to stop Al Qaeda and its partners, which include ISIS.
I want to cap and end this conversation with by returning to Palestine because, as you said, that's something we shouldn't lose sight of. Many analysts believe that the genocide will not end until there is some change of American policy towards Palestine and Israel. Given Trump's new appointment to the Middle East, Mike Waltz, as the national security advisor, who is an extreme Zionist, is a very racist hawk. I mean, even hawk is not a good word. Very racist things he has said about Iran. He blames Iran about the assassination plot for Donald Trump, but he also has said that Israelis should go on and finish the job quickly, which is to finish the genocide so that Iran can be taught a lesson. My question is, does this mean the genocide would go on and with some sort of resistance? And the second question is, do you think that some progressive commentators who were speaking out against American atrocities, against Israeli atrocities, had hopes regarding a second Trump government? Do you think they were blatantly wrong or naive?
Well, you're right. He is a racist person. And I advise all of your viewers to go and read the Department of Justice uh, text on the assassination, the alleged assassination plot. It's really ridiculous. And it's clear that the whole story is just a fabrication. What really happened was that the deep state, assassinated Trump, and now they're trying to, you know, turn attention away and point, to the Iranians. But if anyone goes and reads the online text put out by the U.S. Justice Department, they'll see that it's just a bogus story. It's absolutely ridiculous. Some guy was in jail in the United States for years, and then I don't want to get into it, but anyway,
To
but
be to on a lighter note, to be fair to Walls, though, like people who have assassinated so many innocent people across the world, I think it's fair. It's fair to think that others would also have the same sinister design against us.
well, I agree with that, but the point is that what the Justice Department put out is just a ridiculous story. It's a story that just cannot be believed, and it cannot be proven as well. But beyond that, I don't want to say that those who voted for Trump were naive, because I understand where they're coming from. People are desperate about the United States. It's a fanatical regime, a uniparty of sorts, where both parties are just as extreme. And Trump is not more pro-Israel than Biden. Biden called himself a Zionist. And the people who run the U.S. government, foreign policy for sure, are the Secretary of State, a Zionist supremacist, and Jake Sullivan. Who's these two people? Their loyalty is to Israel, not to the United States. They're the ones in charge. Their ideology is clear that their top priority is Israel, not the United States. So Trump cannot be more extreme than them. But he's no better. But I understand why people would vote for him, because he was speaking against the wars. So well, I have friends and acquaintances who did vote for Trump in the desperate hope that maybe Trump would be sincere. And I have friends and acquaintances who voted for Harris because of some word she said when a student said there's a genocide in Gaza, and she said, something she said and then later retracted, they voted for her in the desperate hope that she would change course. But I was in my opinion, neither would change. There's zero chance that Trump would change course or that Harris would change course. And that the United States that we see today is just this regime that carries out war after war, that supports genocide after genocide, that supports terror, death, and destruction across the world, and preaches to us as it does it.
On that note of pessimism of intellect, Professor Mohammad Marandi, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.